Hello and welcome to this second instalment of the second week's lecture, in which we're going to explore a bit further the nature of this, what I'm calling the spirituality of abuse and trauma, which seems at first glance perhaps to be a bit of a strange way to understand it, but when we understand spirit to be synonymous with life itself, then understanding the dynamics of the conditions which enable us to live and to thrive and to expand and grow as a people is an important foundation that we need to lay in the attempt to understand abuse and trauma, and how we as spiritual carers and as counsellors who seek to listen through a spiritual lens in that sense ought to be listening to those who are living with all kinds of life situations resulting from abuse and the trauma that comes with it. And so in the first part of the lecture, we kind of started to move towards this understanding of human self-consciousness and the way we perceive ourselves to be in the world, so that we can get a sense from a spiritual perspective of what abuse does to us, what abuse means to us in that sense of our self-consciousness, our understanding of ourselves as living, thriving beings in the world today. And we arrived at the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher, that fantastically named Western liberal theologian, who necessarily comes to the question from his perspective as a Western white male theologian and philosopher, but as one deeply sensitive to the lived experience of every human person. And so he's an important theologian and philosopher for those who want to delve deeply into what spiritual care is and what it means. And in the first part of this lecture, we started to unpack a little bit the dynamics that Schleiermacher pointed us to of the self-consciousness, the consciousness of ourselves as beings who are both dependent on our environment to be and to live, and also free from that environment. In other words, we are free agents. We are able to change our environment. We're able to affect our own impact on the environment in order to create the external conditions or change the external environment to enable us to thrive. So dependence and freedom are very much part of the conditions under which we are able to stay alive, and very much part of our self-consciousness as beings, and part of our sense of the meaning of the world. Humility in that sense is crucial to our sense of ourselves and meaning in the world, as we learn to live as creatures who are dependent on the beautiful complexity of our environment. We are not only free agents. When we seek to only dominate our environment begins to suffer, and by virtue of our environment suffering, we suffer. And so you get that sense of our dependence on a healthy, thriving environment. But we are free to a limited degree, and we can change our environment, and we can move ourselves and change our position in our environment, change the way we interact with those elements that we depend upon in order to help us to thrive and grow and to live with meaning and joy and relationship. These are all parts of who we are. And this spiritual dynamic, that's what I'm calling it, this spiritual correlation between dependence and freedom is crucial for us to understand about ourselves if we are to get an understanding of what is occurring spiritually for the person who is subject to abuse and who experiences trauma and the complications that can come with trauma. I've got a slideshow here that I'm referring to, so you'll see me look at that occasionally, and I'll put that slideshow up on ARC for you to see shortly. But in Schleiermacher's view, there's a tension or a creative correlation, correlation. One depends on the other in order for life to be. Between this dependence and freedom in our experience. In other philosophical ways of approaching this question, it's been known as the difference between determinism and agency, or finitude and eternity, or existence and essence, a little bit less concretely. But Friedrich Schleiermacher is the theologian who invited us to consider this dynamic as the heart of our spirituality and the catalyst for all future theological language in his view. And he believed that both our feeling of dependence and our feeling of freedom are ultimately founded, or the foundation of both of those experiences is what he called the feeling of absolute dependence. And Paul Tillich, the theologian who I think rescued Friedrich Schleiermacher from his critics, called this finite freedom, freedom that is limited by our finitude. I'll read you a quote from Schleiermacher. I don't know if it's going to help that much, but it's good sometimes to go directly to the source. And if you want to wrestle with Schleiermacher on this, the first few chapters of his seminal work, Christian Theology, are worth having a look at. He says this: the self-consciousness which accompanies all our activity, so everything we do, is precisely a consciousness of absolute dependence. So underneath everything, we perceive ourselves to be creatures who are absolutely dependent. We cannot be without the presence of our creative environment. For it is, he goes on to say, for it is the consciousness that the whole of our spontaneous activity, our agency, comes from a source outside of us. We were born without choosing to be born. We're here we are. This organism that is me has all kinds of capacities that I didn't choose, and so often I don't decide to engage. They happen just as part of the spontaneous activity of being alive. I don't choose to take every breath. I don't choose every time my heart takes a beat. So in that sense, I am utterly dependent on myself as an organism in this environment. He goes on to say, let me go back. For it is the consciousness that the whole of our spontaneous activity comes from a source outside of us in just the same sense in which anything towards which we should have a feeling of absolute freedom must have proceeded entirely from ourselves. So the sense that we're free emerges out of ourselves as dependent creatures. But without any feeling of freedom, a feeling of absolute dependence would not be possible. And there's the circular correlation. So actually, the fact that we feel ourselves to be free and able to affect agency on our environment and so on perpetually reminds us that that freedom is limited. It is finite. It is ultimately dependent. Schleiermacher described this as the correlation based on the question of the whence of our receptive and active existence. Where did it come from? And that's, in his view, the question of God. I'll continue reading from him. I don't know if you're finding this helpful or not, but I find it really interesting, and it will lay this foundation as we get a sense of ourselves as spiritual on the basis of this living dynamic. He says this whence is not the world in the sense of the totality of temporal existence, and still less is it any single part of the world. For we have a feeling of freedom, though indeed a limited one, in relation to the world, since we are complementary parts of it, and also since we are continually exercising an influence on its individual parts. And moreover, there is the possibility of our exercising influence on all its parts. And while this does permit a limited feeling of dependence. It excludes the absolute feeling of absolute dependence. The feeling of absolute dependence is the feeling of the fact that the fundamental relation must include all others in itself. I'll say that again because I've fumbled a bit and you might find that difficult to understand. The feeling of absolute dependence is the feeling of the fact that the fundamental relation, the fundamental sense of ourselves as relating beings, must include all others in itself. So the freedom of being able to go out into the world and relate is based on a sense that we are actually utterly and completely dependent on the world as a relating organism. I know it's complex. I know it takes a little bit of staying with and wrestling with to understand this spiritual dynamic of ourselves. But I challenge you to stay with it. I challenge you to wrestle with this underlying spiritual dynamic of ourselves, because in perhaps more easily accessible language, it is the spiritual nature of every human person as humility and love. Humility and love. The capacity to accept that we are dependent on others in our environment, and the capacity to go out and to change the environment to enhance life, and we might call that love. In Albert Schweitzer's thought, this is the realisation that the will to live, our will to live, which is part of our cellular structure, pre-conscious physiology, necessarily includes all wills to live. I cannot have absolute freedom because my will to live must include the universal will to live. My living depends absolutely on your living, and this is the source of ethics, and what underlies it is the humility for me to accept that you have a space in the world as well as I, and that together, both of us thriving enhances life itself. Let me read the paragraph from my paper that I gave you to read on page 6 that I think sums this up in the way that I would share it with you. We spoke about the numinous power in the first part of the lecture. The numinous power in a thing provokes a feeling response that includes wonder, awe, and terror. It is related to the feeling of mystery that comes with the realisation of tension between the sense of absolute dependence on our environment and the sense of autonomy and freedom from that environment. It is this tension that leads to the evolution of reason as that which grasps, shapes, and sometimes manipulates the environment of the organism, us, me. The physiology of the human organism is numinous in that this tension between dependence on the environment and freedom from the environment is inherent in its processes of homeostatic regulation. In other words, this is not only conscious reflective spirituality, it is pre-conscious embodied physiology as spirituality. The immanence of this tension in the physiological organism means that the organism is irreducible. The organism cannot be reduced to determined matter, and it cannot be reduced to immaterial autonomy. So, that is what I'm suggesting is the underlying spiritual dynamic that we want to understand as part of human life in order to understand the nature of abuse. Just going to get rid of some of these things on my computer. They keep distracting me. So, it's from this understanding of spirituality that we can approach our inquiry about more fully and completely about this spirituality of abuse. Abuse, from a spiritual perspective, could be said to be prevention of the element of freedom in an other by a person seeking their own freedom at the expense of the victim. And this brings us back to the story of Hagar that we spent some time with in the first part of the lecture. When I inhibit your freedom by exercising my power, my agency over yours in a way that reduces your capacity to freely determine your place in your environment, then I have abused you. That is the spiritual underlying, the spiritual nature of abuse. Me asserting my powerful free agency over yours. So in fact, I become an intolerable determining factor in your life. I determine you by reducing your freedom, and so I become guilty of abusing you. That is the spirituality of abuse. And we can see, I think, how this played out in the life of Hagar, where the three powerful characters in the story, Yahweh, Abram and Sarai, asserted their own free agency, their power to determine their environment and to determine Hagar's life and outcomes for Hagar, were experienced by her as considerably abusive. She was a silenced victim in that story. And this is an extraordinary understanding of abuse, I think, a spiritual understanding of abuse. And it applies, I think, to all forms of abuse, both individual, interpersonal abuse, relational abuse, but also structural abuse, abuse that emerges in our experience by virtue of the fact that our freedom is reduced and our lives become determined by social, political and economic structures that are beyond our control to do anything about. Paul Tillich named this kind of dynamic the demonic. Any structural, social or political or religious way of being that reduces the freedom of those individuals who participate in it and determines them to the point of rendering them powerless. That is abusive, and in that sense, because it renders us powerless, we can name it demonic. Not in the sense that it's a little ghost running around in a supernatural world perpetrating abuse against us, but that in fact it is a structure that has emerged out of our own human experience that has become so determining of us and our environment that we lose our freedom, we lose our agency. And so that balance between humility and love is thrown off. We are humiliated and unable to offer love with the free and powerful agency of a thriving human person. The Johannine tradition links this indelibly to the way we understand ourselves in relation to God. You remember in the first letter of John, chapter 4, the author says, "Those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." So this relational dynamic where abuse reduces the element of love and humiliates the other is in fact a repudiation of our understanding of the divine life of God. The Johannine statement holds within it the idea that the metaphors of spirituality and religion can never be abstracted from their physiological origins, from who we actually are in our current concrete existence. For this reason, the idea of the numinous, the spiritual power of a thing, of ourselves as things, is central to how we understand the spirituality of the organism. Albert Schweitzer, as I said earlier, named this as the will to live amongst other wills to live, and his work is crucial in understanding what we mean by this. So I think as spiritual carers who understand abuse in this sense, that it actually goes to the core of our humanness, the core of our human self-consciousness, and indeed the core of our identity, that this is precisely what we are listening for as spiritual carers when we work with those who have experienced abuse, and who are living with post-traumatic stress disorders or who are working their way through post-traumatic growth. Spiritual care must listen for the earliest physiological signals of spirituality as the emerging consciousness of the inner process of homeostatic regulation through metaphors of meaning. The understanding of ourselves as beings who thrive when we hold together humility, a sense of our dependence, and agency, a sense of ourselves as loving, creative, reasoning beings. So abuse goes to the heart of our humanness. And there are many ways in which we can work as counsellors and psychologists and other kinds of helping therapists with those who live in the midst of these experiences. The distinctive of spiritual care in this context is to listen to what abuse and trauma mean in terms of this balance of dependence and freedom, this balance of humility and love that enables us to thrive in ourselves. We're listening deeply for it, and it becomes evident in and through our behaviours, in and through our physiological responses to our environment, our capacity or otherwise to relate meaningfully and creatively with others and the world around us. I want to finish this part of the lecture with a beautiful quote from Bessel van der Kolk's book, in which he says this, and I think this really leads us deeply into what it means to listen as spiritual carers to the person living with trauma and to the person who has been abused. He says this: the challenge of recovery is to re-establish ownership of your body and your mind, and I would say re-establish ownership of your organic self. And he says, of yourself, to re-establish ownership of your body and your mind, of yourself. This means feeling free to know what you know and to feel what you feel without becoming overwhelmed, enraged, ashamed, or collapsed. What he's getting to is the fact that your experiences of abuse, your traumatic self, that part of you that has been traumatized, is very much part of the way you have developed to be as a self-conscious human person. Your capacity to live with humility and love, with dependence and agency, has been impacted by experiences of abuse and the resulting trauma. Recovery, healing, restoration, transformation comes not through trying to deny that about ourselves, but through recognizing who we are, embracing ourselves and who we have developed and grown to be through all of our myriad experiences, affirming ourselves, validating who we are in response to our experiences, and in a sense embracing ourselves, not allowing our own lived experience to cause us shame, cause us further trauma, feelings of being overwhelmed, enraged, or collapsed. That is the path to restoration, to growth, to freedom and humility in the most creative combination. And that is what we are listening for. We are listening for the human person, the whole human person, who has been traumatized, has been abused, and who has within them the marks and the story in their very physiological presence. And not by virtue of repudiating that is healing found, but by virtue of recognition, of seeing oneself, affirming oneself, and enabling oneself as a valuable, intrinsically wonderful human person, an irreducible, complex mystery worthy of love and acceptance. this is the way to go forward. Thank you for sharing with me.